Hey everybody, DoctorDeadwax here, Mark. Next thread I'm going to do a response to is Blake's book thread. I'm going to do things with a bit of a Canadian theme, so here goes. The first book I don't actually have. I've talked about it before. I know Frank, Mr. 666 Skulls, picked it up and really enjoyed it, so I recommend, even if you don't buy this book, see if your library has it. It's called The Top 100 Canadian Albums, and it's by Bob Mersereau, Mersereau. I'll put that in the link since I can't show the book. So this is like what Bob considers to be the top 100 albums of all time in Canada, kind of in the rock genre. And it's pretty good. It's a good book. I mean, after he fully details 98 Neil Young albums, he covers records by 2 other bands. Okay, that's a joke. He does 8 Neil Young albums, which I think is far too many, and a couple bands were left out, but it's still a great book. It really hits, it covers like a lot of decades with pretty even coverage. It doesn't just focus on one small window, which sometimes these kind of books do. There's a whole bunch of albums there that if you're not from Canada you never would have heard of, that you deserve to listen to, that are great records. It could have been a little bit more, only 4 records from Quebec, so there could have been a little bit more representation there, but that's kind of typical up here. So that's one I'd recommend. Next one, not so much a rock and roll book, but I'm going to recommend it anyway. It's Daniel Richler, Kicking Tomorrow. But I mean, look at this head of hair. He's a rock star. Come on. But seriously, Daniel was Mordecai Richler's son, or is Mordecai Richler's son, who's a massive icon in Canadian literature, and has had several books of his made by films in Hollywood. And so Daniel grew up the son of an icon, writer, and subsequently got into journalism and writing. He worked for like the CBC up here, and eventually got a job on a little show called The New Music, which pre the video era was just the most amazing bit of television journalism associated with music. And they would interview all the bands that were coming through Toronto, and just wild interviews, wild stuff. I remember, I think it was J.D. Roberts, who you would now know as John Roberts. He's one of your news anchors. I remember there was like a famous interview where him and Jeannie Becker were interviewing The Who, and they nearly killed them because they were asking very inappropriate questions about a tragedy that occurred at one of their concerts. And I believe that that's how Daniel actually got the job, was because a lot of bands said, okay, we're not being interviewed by those prats again. So, but great interviews. All the punk new wave bands that came through Toronto were interviewed on that show. All of the local kind of punk new wave alternative bands were interviewed on that show. And it'd be great if that archive ever became publicly available and everything came out that was in that. So Daniel wrote a book, and it's about like just a boy coming of age in Montreal kind of story. And I really like it, and it's really good. And he kind of qualifies because, did I already do this? At the height of the punk era, he was lead singer of the Alpha Jerks. So, and Daniel's moved on to do like book television, and he's still writing, and he's a great guy. He signed my book for me too. And we had this huge laugh about his dad. It was really funny. The last book I'm going to recommend is this. This is Dave Bidini, On a Cold Road, Tales of Adventure in Canadian Rock. Dave Bidini is a member of the rock band The Real Statics. They no longer exist, but he's still performing as a Bidini band, which is just not what the Real Statics were. The Real Statics are icons. Unheard of, unknown icons, you might say. if you're a musician, you know who the Real Statics are. They're constantly referenced as an influence. And they helped kind of spearhead a revival in Canadian music in the 80s and late 80s and the 90s. And so there's a band up here that's just massive called the Tragically Hip, like a party rock band, and they get to tour Canada doing like stadiums and hockey rinks and stuff, and they take bands out that need some exposure. And one year they took some friends of mine out, Chris Brown and Kate Fenner, who I talked about before, who were in the Bourbon Tabernacle Choir, and another year they took out the Real Statics. And so Bidini kept notes of his tour across Canada with the Hip, like kept a journal, diary, and this book is about that. But also he subsequently interviewed a whole bunch of Canadian icons, rock and roll icons, like members of BTO, Gatto, the Stampeders, Max Webster, Crowbar, the Guess Who, Triumph, Trooper, Bruce Coburn, Gail Garnett, and even Tommy Chong. So he interviews all those people, and they share their road tales and anecdotes of traveling across Canada. So it's quite a fun romp, and there's some great stories that some of these bands talk about, rolling into gigs or rolling out of gigs, or there's one where there's often stories of how people nearly died, in the middle of nowhere in a blizzard, trying to get to the next gig to make $8. So that's quite a fascinating read. One of Bidini's things I've heard him talk about, I'm not sure if it's actually referenced in the book, but it could be. He talks about how Canada is such a hard place for a rock and roll band to grow and become something, because if you want to tour here, you're driving 8 hours between gigs or 16 hours between gigs. I know years ago, my wife and I saw a couple Indigo Girls dates in the States, and in New York State they did 12 nights, between New York City and then rolling up through the state, and they'd play Albany, and then they'd play Rochester, and then they'd play another little town of like 6,000 people that would sell out a 3,000 seat room. And so they did like 12 dates from New York City to Buffalo. If you're a band in Canada, you might do 12 dates across Canada. And so he talks about you're 4 guys, you're 21 years old, you got one of your buddies is going to do sound, another guy's going to help you with equipment. 6 of you are packed into your dad's old Delta 88 with a trailer strapped across the back, and you're driving across Canada 8, 10, 12 hours between gigs, playing for like 15 people, roll back into the stinking car and drive for another 12 hours to play another gig for 45 people or 12 people or 6 people. He says if you can get across Canada that first tour and still remain friends, your band can last a hell of a long time. And the Real Statics did. I think they stuck it out almost 20 years before they folded shop. So it's a really good read, and it's got this great cover painting by Martin Tielli, who was the lead guitar player in the Real Statics. Sadly, they reissued this book, and because the whole world is about change, is progress, they put a different cover on it that looks like total shit. But check that book out. Dave Bidini's On a Cold Road. Daniel Richler's. Oh, yeah, I meant to mention this one's signed too. Dave Bidini's On a Cold Road. Daniel Richler's Kicking Tomorrow, and Bob Mersereau's Top 100 Canadian Albums. Great thread idea, Blake, and thanks for bringing it up and giving me a chance to blather.